My stepmother stole my late mother's bracelet, but the Alpha King still chose me, a werewolf romance story. The bracelet was gone. I knew it the moment I opened the cedar box beside my bed. The velvet indent where it always rested, empty, cold, like a wound. My mother's bracelet, silver and moonstone. She wore it the night she died. The nurses said she kept touching it, whispering my name. They pressed it into my palm at the hospital, still warm from her wrist. And now my stepmother had given it to her daughter to wear to the Luna selection, the one event I had trained my entire life for. The one night I was supposed to finally step out of the shadows. I stood in that empty room, barefoot on cold stone, wearing a dress sewn from curtain fabric, while downstairs my stepsister Mireille laughed in my mother's silver. They never thought I'd walk through those palace doors. They never thought anyone would look twice at me. They were wrong. Before we step into the story, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you hearing this under the midnight moon or in the quiet of the afternoon? Drop it in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Chapter 1. The night everything was taken. I smelled the rain before it fell. That was always my gift. Not strength like the warrior-born girls in my pack. Not speed like the daughters of alphas who trained in silver rings since age 7. My gift was something quieter, a sharpness in my nose, a stillness in my chest, a knowing that arrived before the world caught up. Tonight I smelled rain, and smoke, and something ancient stirring in the dark beyond the Ashveil Mountains. But I didn't have time to think about any of it, because my stepmother Corinna was standing in the doorway of my room, and she was holding my bracelet. Not holding it, actually. She was clasping it onto Mireille's wrist. My name is Anna Moonvale. I am 19 years old. I have lived in this house since I was 7, the year my father remarried and brought Corinna and her 2 daughters through our front door like they owned it, which eventually they did. My father died 4 years ago. A hunting accident, they said. I never believed that. But grief makes you quiet in ways that keep you alive. The house passed to Corinna. Everything inside it passed to Corinna, including, apparently, the silver and moonstone bracelet my mother left me. It was just sitting there, Corinna said, her voice smooth as river stones. She didn't look at me. She was adjusting the clasp on Mireille's wrist, tilting it toward the lamplight. Gathering dust. Mireille needs something that speaks of legacy for tonight. The selection panel will notice. I stared at the bracelet catching the light. Crescent moons etched between each moonstone bead. My mother's initials, E.V., pressed into the clasp in the old script. That bracelet belonged to my mother, I said. Corinna finally looked at me. Her eyes were pale, almost colorless. She smiled the way she always smiled when she knew she'd won. And now it belongs to the house, she said, which belongs to me. Mireille turned her wrist in the light, watching the stones shimmer. She didn't even look up at me. That was the part that broke something open in my ribs. Not cruelty, just indifference. Like I wasn't worth the energy of a glance. Her sister Dalla leaned against the doorframe behind them, picking at her nails. You should be grateful you're even allowed to attend, Anna. Most Omegas don't get a selection invitation at all. I said nothing, because she was right, and because I had learned over 12 years under this roof that silence was armor. The Luna selection happened once every 7 years. Every unmated female of age across the 5 packs was summoned to the Ashveil Palace. 3 days of trials, feasts, and ceremonies, and at the end, if the Alpha King was present, he could invoke the ancient right of first choosing. He hadn't invoked it in 30 years. No one thought he would this time either. I pulled my dress from behind the door. I'd sewn it myself, from ivory curtain linen I'd bought at the market with 2 weeks of coin saved from mending work. It was simple. No embroidery, no jeweled hem, no dynasty crest stitched along the collar. Just clean lines, a fitted bodice, and a neckline I'd stayed up 3 nights to get right. Corinna looked at it and laughed, a short, dismissive sound, like air leaving a punctured tire. You look like a house servant, she said. Then at least I look like what I am, I said. She stopped laughing. I folded the dress over my arm, picked up my worn leather bag, and walked past all three of them without another word. The night air hit me at the front door. Cold, clean, full of pine and distant thunder. And underneath it all, underneath the rain and the dark and the mountain wind, I smelled something I had never smelled before. Power. Old and enormous and deliberate, like a fire banked for centuries, just now deciding to breathe. It was coming from the direction of the palace. My feet stopped moving, my chest pulled tight. The knowing arrived, the way it always did, before my mind could argue with it. Something is waiting for you there. I almost turned back, almost let that fear root me to the porch steps forever. But then I heard Mireille laughing through the front window, her high silver laugh, and I felt my mother's absence on my bare wrist like a cold ring of air. I picked up my bag. I walked into the dark. I did not look back. The selection had begun. Chapter 2, How We Got Here. Let me tell you about my mother. Her name was Elin Moonvale, and she was the kind of woman who made rooms go quiet, not because she demanded it, but because she was so entirely, completely herself, that people naturally stilled to watch. She had dark hair that curled in the rain. She smelled like cedar, and something sweet I could never name. She laughed with her whole body. She died when I was 6, a fever that moved too fast. By the time the pack healers arrived, she was already gone. My father was never the same after. Calder Moonvale had been a mid-rank enforcer in our pack, the Ashveil. Nothing celebrated, nothing grand, but steady and proud and good. After my mother died, the steadiness left him like water from a cracked cup. He drank more. He worked less. He stopped looking at me directly, because I had her eyes, dark gray, almost silver, and I think it was just too much. 3 years after my mother died, Corinna arrived. She was from the Duskfall pack, higher ranked than ours, and everyone in Ashveil knew it. She had 2 daughters by a previous mating bond that had dissolved, a wardrobe worth more than our house, and a smile she used like a blade. My father married her inside of 6 months. I remember standing at the ceremony in the pack hall, wearing a yellow dress my grandmother had bought me, watching Corinna adjust his collar with practiced proprietary fingers. I was 9 years old. I understood nothing and everything. The daughters came with her. Mireille, who was 2 years older than me, beautiful in the way of a painting, perfect, still, designed to be admired. And Dalla, a year younger than Mireille, who had inherited her mother's pale eyes and none of her polish. Where Mireille was cold marble, Dalla was sharp gravel. Within a month, my bedroom had been given to Mireille. I moved to the back room off the kitchen, the old storage room, with the small window that fogged every winter. My things migrated to corners. My presence shrank. My father noticed, I think. But he was already so far inside, whatever dark water grief had pulled him into that noticing and doing were 2 entirely different countries. The bracelet was the one thing Corinna never touched during those years. I think she didn't know its value, at first, didn't realize it was old-world silver, didn't understand that the moonstones had been set by a bonded jeweler from the Cradle Pack, back when that tradition still existed. To her, it looked like sentimental old jewelry. I wore it every day, to school, to the market, to pack gatherings I attended in the margins. I wore it until the clasp grew familiar as a heartbeat. When my father died, the lawyer came with papers. The house, the land, the accounts, all transferred to Corinna as the surviving bonded mate. I had no standing. I was unmated, Omega ranked, and barely 19. The law had no shelf for me. I could have left. The thought had a shape. Pack my bag, take the North Road, find work in one of the border towns, start over in the way that people with nothing start over. But my mother was buried in the Ashveil cemetery under a white stone with her name in the old script, and leaving meant leaving her. So I stayed. I mended clothes for coin. I kept the kitchen clean in exchange for room. I made myself small and useful and invisible, which are 3 things that feel like safety when you have nowhere else to go. And then the selection summons arrived. 1 ivory envelope with my name on it in silver ink. Delivered by a palace messenger who barely glanced at me before riding off. Corinna held the envelope for a long moment before giving it to me. I watched something move across her face, calculation, cold and quick. She handed it over without a word. I opened it alone in the back room. Anna Moonvale of the Ashveil Pack. You are summoned to the Luna selection at Ashveil Palace. Report at the eastern gate by nightfall on the 3rd day of the cold moon. I read it 4 times. Then I sat down on the edge of my narrow bed, pressed the letter flat against my knee, and cried, quietly, the way I'd learned to do everything in that house. Not from sadness, from something I didn't have a word for yet. Later I would learn the word was hope, and hope, I was about to discover, was the most dangerous thing I'd ever carried. Chapter 3. The Road to the Palace. The road to Ashveil was 12 miles of pines and cold. I walked the first 2 miles alone. The carriage Corinna had hired, a rented, wood-paneled thing with a cracked door that whistled in the wind, had left an hour before me, packed with Mireya's trunks and Dalla's hat boxes, and Corinna's pressed authority. There had been no seat left for me. Whether this was an accident or a decision, nobody said. I preferred walking, actually. The truth of it surprised me. But there was something about moving through the dark, with just the sound of my own footsteps, that felt like breathing for the first time in weeks. The pines on either side were old, enormous, dark-needled, exhaling cold air like slow lungs. Above them, the moon was rising, and it was fuller than I'd seen it in years. Not quite whole. Almost. The way a held breath feels right before release. I had gone about 4 miles when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun. My hand went to nothing. I had no weapon, no rank, no backup, just reflex and 12 years of living carefully. It was a girl, younger than me by at least 2 years, with wide brown eyes and a pack of belongings so overstuffed it tilted her sideways as she walked. She stopped when she saw me, chest heaving from exertion. "Sorry," she gasped. "I thought you were a night cat. The black ones, they've been spotted on this road." "I'm not a night cat," I said. "I can see that now." She blew out a breath and resettled her pack. "I'm Pell Darrow from the Fernholt Pack. My ride group left without me because I went back for my grandmother's shawl, and now I'm going to be late, and if I'm late, they'll rank me last, and if they rank me last, I'll be placed in the outer dormitory, which apparently floods when it rains, and it's going to rain." She said all of this very fast, without pausing. "Anna Moonvale," I said. "Ashveil Pack." Pell's expression changed. Something softened in it. "Ashveil? My grandmother's people were Ashveil, before the border shift." She looked me up and down, then looked at my dress. "You sewed that yourself?" "Yes. It's beautiful," she said simply. Nobody had said that to me. Not tonight. Not in recent memory. We walked together the rest of the way. Pell talked the way some people breathed, constantly, naturally, without apparent effort. She told me about her family's goat farm, and the brother who'd joined the warrior ranks, and the grandmother who read weather in the direction of smoke. She told me about the selection rules she'd memorized from a pamphlet. 3 days, 4 trials of perception, endurance, protocol, and instinct. No healing magic, no outside assistance. Final selections announced at the choosing feast. "Do you think he'll actually be there?" she asked. "The Alpha King." "I don't know," I said. "They say he's been in seclusion for 2 years, ever since his bonded mate died." She paused. "Is it true she died in the cradle collapse?" I heard different stories. "I don't know enough to say." Pell was quiet for a moment. That was rare enough that I noticed. "I'm not here for the king," she said finally. "I'm here because my pack elders said the selection trials build rank for Omegas, even if you don't get chosen. You finish all 4 trials, your standing goes up regardless." She glanced at me sideways. "What about you?" I thought of the cedar box, the velvet indent, the cold. "I'm here because I have to be," I said. We crested the hill and the palace came into view. Ashveil was not beautiful the way stories described it, not spires and white stone and banners in the moonlight. It was enormous and dark and old, built from gray granite that had absorbed 3 centuries of storms. Torches burned along the outer wall in orange lines. The eastern gate was open, spilling warm gold light onto the road. And outside it, in that gold light, something moved that made every hair on my body rise. A figure. Alone. Standing at the edge of the torchlight, rather than in it, as though watching the stream of arrivals without being seen. Even at that distance, even through the crowd of carts and girls and nervous voices, I smelled it again. That power, that ancient banked fire. My feet stopped moving. Pell turned back. Anna? The figure's head turned in my direction. Even from 50 yards away, I felt it like a hand pressed against my sternum. He was watching me. Chapter 4. Inside the walls, I told myself I'd imagined it. The figure was gone by the time Pell and I reached the gate, swept into shadow or back inside the palace walls. I filed through the eastern entrance with 40 other girls in a river of nerves and perfume and hushed voices, and I told myself I had imagined the weight of that gaze and the smell of that power and the way my chest had pulled toward a stranger in the dark. I was good at telling myself things. Years of practice. The palace interior was overwhelming, not in the glittering, ceremonial sense I'd expected, but in raw scale. The entry hall had ceilings 3 stories high, hung with iron chandeliers lit by beeswax candles that dripped gold onto the slate floor below. The walls were stone, the tapestries old and dark-threaded, the floors worn smooth by centuries of feet. It smelled like cold granite and wood smoke and something underneath both. Something mineral and sharp, I would later learn, was the scent signature of the Iron Veil pack. The Alpha Kings pack. The registration desk was staffed by 2 women in dark gray and a man whose expression had not changed since, I suspected, birth. I gave my name. He found it on his list, bottom quarter, near the back, exactly where an Ashvin Omega would land in a ranked selection. Dormitory 7, he said, and handed me a copper token. Pell got Dormitory 4. She squeezed my arm before they separated us. Find me at breakfast, she said. I'll save you bread. Dormitory 7 was smaller than the others. I learned this later, comparing notes. 8 cots in a low-ceilinged room at the back of the east wing, the kind of space that had probably been a supply room in an earlier century. 6 of the 8 girls there were Omegas from low-ranked packs. We introduced ourselves in the tired, careful way of people who have learned not to expect much. I chose the cot nearest the window. Old habit. I like to see sky. I had just unfolded my single spare dress onto the mattress when the door opened and Mireille walked in. We stared at each other. Mireille was in Dormitory 7 because, I would learn from the girl on the cot beside me, who knew everything and whispered it constantly. Her pre-selection rank had been scored lower than expected after an altercation at last year's pack gathering. Something about a disputed courtship claim. The details were complicated. What was not complicated was the way Mireille looked at the small room, at the other girls, at the cot left for her beside the cracked wall, and then at me. And then at my bare wrist. My mother's bracelet was still on hers. The moonstone beads caught the candlelight as she crossed the room and settled on her cot like she was performing grace under injury. She didn't speak to me. I didn't speak to her. But in the space between our cots, something ancient and specific passed, the specific silence of 2 people who share a wound they've never named. The first trial was the next morning. We were woken before dawn by a bell, deep and resonant, reverberating through the stone walls like a struck tuning fork. We dressed in the dark, ate cold bread in the main hall, and were led in groups of 10 to the trial chambers. The first trial was called Perception. A room. Empty or appearing empty. 10 objects placed at various distances and heights, each emitting a different scent. Identify all 10 in correct order of intensity without crossing the room's center line. Most girls identified 6 or 7. The top scorers got 8. I identified all 10, and I placed them in order before the timekeeper's candle had burned down to its halfway mark. The examiner, a narrow woman with reading spectacles and a clipboard, looked up at me over the rims of her glasses. "Anna Moonvale," she said, checking her list. "Ashveil, Omega rank." "Yes," I said. She wrote something. I couldn't read it from where I stood. I walked back to the main hall and found Pell at a corner table, and she handed me a bread roll with an expression of fierce, uncomplicated loyalty that made my throat tight. "How did you do?" she asked. "Fine," I said. Behind me, across the hall, I felt a gaze settle on my back like a warm hand on cold stone. I did not turn around. Chapter 5, The Second Trial and a Burning Secret. There are moments that change the temperature of a story. This was one of them. The second trial was called Endurance, and it had nothing to do with physical strength. I want to be clear about that, because the name was misleading, and I think it was meant to be. The hallmasters at Ashveil had been designing these trials for 300 years. They knew exactly what they were doing. We were led into a long stone room with no windows, and seated in individual chairs spaced far enough apart that you couldn't make eye contact with anyone beside you. The room was kept at the temperature of a cold morning, not punishing, just uncomfortable in the steady, grinding way that makes you aware of every breath. Then they brought in the speakers, pack elders, one from each of the 5 packs, seated at the front of the room, and for 2 hours they spoke, not to us exactly, but at us, about failure, rejection, lineage lacking, mates lost, futures unrealized. They spoke slowly and precisely, and they never raised their voices. They called it a meditation exercise. It was a cruelty exam. The point, I understood partway through, was not to break you. It was to see how you held yourself when everything soft was stripped away. The examiners walked the rows, watching faces. A girl 2 chairs from me began to cry silently around the 40-minute mark. Another had gone rigid, staring at the wall. A third, a high-ranked girl from the Iron Veil pack, who'd arrived in a private carriage, had her jaw set so hard I could see it from 6 feet away. I closed my eyes, not to escape, to go somewhere specific. I went to the memory of my mother's hands. The way they looked in winter light, darker at the knuckle, warm-palmed, always slightly rough from her garden work. The way she'd pressed the bracelet into my small fist and said, "This is not jewelry. This is a door. Whenever you're lost, Anna, this brings you home." I held that memory like a stone, solid and warm, and mine. When the 2 hours ended and the bell rang, the examiners wrote their notes. I saw the narrow woman with the glasses look across the room at me. She wrote something, then underlined it. After the trial, the girls clustered in the main hall in the specific way of people who needed to process difficulty in company. I found Pell, who looked wrung out but intact, and we sat together by one of the high windows. "I thought about my brother," she said. "The one in the warrior ranks. He almost died in the border skirmish 3 years ago, and I never told him I was scared. I should have told him." "You can still tell him," I said. She nodded, not entirely convinced. Then she leaned in. "Anna, something is happening." "What do you mean?" "People are talking. The staff." I was near the kitchens after the first trial, and 2 palace attendants were arguing in low voices about tonight's dinner seating, and one of them said that he had changed the placement himself, personally, which apparently he never does. I looked at her. "He who?" Pell gave me a very deliberate look. "The Alpha King, Anna. He's here. He's been here since last night, and he hasn't shown himself publicly, and he already changed the seating arrangement for the feast." I said nothing. "And," Pell continued, lowering her voice further, "the girl from Ironvale, Cassin, the one who arrived in the private carriage, she told someone this morning that she was essentially pre-selected, that there was an arrangement between her father and the palace before the selection even began." Something cold moved through my chest. "That's not legal," I said. "The selection protocols." "I know what's legal," Pell said. "That doesn't always matter." I thought about the empty velvet indent in my cedar box. I thought about legal and what it had ever done for me. "Then what are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying something about this selection isn't what it's supposed to be," Pell said. "And I think you should be careful. Because whatever's happening, you keep being at the center of it without knowing why." That night at dinner, I found my nameplate. Table 7, back corner, expected. But the seat directly across from me, separated by the width of the long table and 6 other place settings, had a nameplate that had clearly been moved recently. The indentation from its previous position was still faintly visible in the cloth. The new nameplate read, "Reserved." I sat down. I unfolded my napkin. I told myself it meant nothing. And then the doors to the main hall opened and the temperature of the entire room changed, the way it does before a storm rolls in. That drop in pressure, that sudden stillness. Every head turned. He walked in alone. No attendants, no ceremonial guard, no fanfare. Just a man moving through a room the way water moves through rock. Not fast, not forceful. Just inevitable. He was taller than I'd expected. Dark-haired, sharp-featured, wearing plain charcoal gray with no insignia. He looked like someone who had decided long ago that power didn't need announcing. He stopped at the head of the center table. His eyes moved across the room, quick, deliberate, not showing where they landed. Except that they did land. I felt it on my skin like the first touch of sun after a long winter. Warm and sudden, and impossible to pretend I hadn't noticed. His name was Evander Crane, Alpha King of the 5 Packs, widower. In seclusion for 2 years, 33 years old. He looked at me for 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then he sat down, and the dinner began. Chapter 6. What Corinna Did Next. I should have slept that night. I lay in my dormitory cot with my eyes at the ceiling, and my mind running like water down a hillside. Fast, directionless, finding every crack. He looked at you, said the part of me that was still 19 and human, and hungry for something to mean something. He looks at everyone, said the part of me that had been trained by life to trust nothing that felt like a gift. I was still arguing with myself when I heard the voices. Low, outside the dormitory window. I turned onto my side and listened with the particular quality of attention I'd developed over years of living in a house where I wasn't supposed to know things. 2 voices. One I recognized immediately. Corinna. I sat up slowly and moved to the window without making a sound. The night air came through the gap in the casement, carrying their words clearly. "Not in the current arrangement," Corinna was saying. "The Iron Veil family has already been promised consideration." The second voice was male, clipped, careful. A palace official, by the flat precision of it. "Consideration isn't selection," Corinna said. "My daughter has legacy, rank history, and the full backing of the Duskfall lineage. I'm not asking for intervention. I'm asking for appropriate waiting." A pause. "The trials determine waiting, Lady Corinna." "The scoring determines waiting," she said, and her voice had a fine edge on it now, the blade she kept under the smooth. "Scoring is human. I'm simply asking that the humans involved remember who brought them their positions." Another pause. Longer. "The instinct trial," the man said finally, "has flexible benchmarks, by tradition." "Good," Corinna said. "Then we understand each other." I heard the sound of footsteps moving away across the courtyard stones. I sat in the dark, very still. My hands were in my lap and they were not shaking. I was past the age of shaking. They were going to fix the instinct trial. The instinct trial was the 4th and final trial, the one that carried the highest weight in selection scoring. Whatever Corinna had just arranged, it was enough to push Mireille into the top tier, regardless of her actual performance. My mother's bracelet on Mireille's wrist. A bribed palace official. An Omega daughter they had decided didn't exist. I thought, so this is how it ends. 12 years and it ends exactly how it began. Me, invisible. Them, triumphant. I thought, or I lay back down on the cot. The moon came through the window crack in a thin white line and fell across my bare wrist, exactly where the bracelet should have been. I closed my eyes. I thought about what my mother said. A door. Whenever you're lost, this brings you home. I thought, I am not lost. I know exactly where I am. By morning, I had a plan. Not a revenge plan. I want to be honest about that. I was not built for revenge, and I knew it. What I had was something quieter and more permanent. I would compete. Fully. Without reservation or self-diminishment, or the careful smallness I'd worn like armor for 12 years. I would compete like my mother's daughter. Whatever happened after that, happened. The third trial was called Protocol, and it was the one everyone expected the high-ranked girls to dominate. Ceremonies, hierarchies, formal address, pack customs, the kind of knowledge you absorbed through childhood banquets and political dinners and parents who taught you which fork to use and how to bow to a beta without lowering your eyes. I didn't have any of that. What I had was 12 years of watching carefully from corners. The Protocol trial was a simulation, a series of rapid social scenarios, each requiring the correct response under time pressure. You were assessed on precision, composure, and cultural accuracy. I moved through them the way I'd learned to move through the world, deliberately, without wasted motion, reading the room before I acted. I did not get a perfect score, but I placed third. The examiner, a new one, older, with a gray braid, and the kind of eyes that see through performance, looked at her clipboard, then at me, with the same expression as the narrow woman from the first trial, like she was revising something she'd assumed. After the trial results were posted in the main hall, I became aware of something I hadn't expected. I was being watched. Not by Evander Crane, who I hadn't seen since dinner. Not by the examiners, by the other girls. The ones from mid-ranked packs, the Omegas, the girls who'd arrived without private carriages and sponsorship letters. They were looking at me the way desert travelers look at water, hopeful and afraid to hope. Pell grabbed my arm at lunch. "You're third in Protocol," she hissed. "Combined with your perception score, you're currently ranked. Don't tell me," I said. "Anna." "Pell," I looked at her. "If I know my rank, I'll start performing instead of competing. Let me just do the work." She stared at me for a moment, then sat back. "You are the strangest person I've ever liked," she said. "That's the kindest thing anyone's said to me in years," I said. And I meant it. Chapter 7. The Instinct Trial. The morning of the Instinct Trial, someone put a folded note under my dormitory door. No signature, no pack seal. Just 4 words in a clean, precise hand. Trust what you smell. I held the note for a long time. Then I folded it twice and pressed it inside my dress against my ribs, where it sat warm and specific against my skin. The Instinct Trial was held in the East Courtyard, an open stone space ringed by high walls, open to the sky. 43 girls in a wide circle. No desks, no chairs, no written elements. Just space and instruction. The trial master, a broad, gray-bearded man from the original Ashveil line, stood at the center. He explained the trial in 6 sentences. You were presented with a series of situations. Each situation required a choice. The choices were designed so that the socially correct answer and the instinctually correct answer were in direct conflict. You were scored on your instinct, not your etiquette. He paused, looked out at the circle, and added, "The purpose of this trial is not to test your training. It is to test whether anything survives your training." Then he looked down at his notes. "There will be an observer present," he said. "You will not see them. That is part of the trial." The first situation was presented as a written card and a physical element. I read the card. A member of your pack is behaving in a way that endangers the group but claims to have information you need. Do you comply or contain? The physical element was a length of red rope. Most of the girls held the rope. Compliance, demonstrated physically. I set it down. Not because I'd calculated the right answer, because the rope felt wrong in my hands the moment I touched it, like holding someone else's truth. The trial master watched me. He didn't write anything. He watched. The second situation was more complex, a tableau of objects representing family, rank, survival, and legacy. We were asked to arrange them in personal order of priority. I arranged mine differently than anyone else in the room. I could see that from the corner of my eye. I arranged them: survival, family, legacy, rank. Rank at the bottom. The girl beside me, Cassin from Iron Vale, perfectly composed, flawless in her trial clothes, had rank first. I smelled something from her direction. Not the sharp alpha blood scent I'd expected from a girl of her lineage. Something thin and rehearsed, like a perfume worn to cover a real smell. Nerves, I realized. Under all that composure and arranged priority and pre-selection confidence, she was afraid. The third situation was different. The trial master's assistant brought in a covered tray and set it at the center of the circle. When the cover was removed, there were 7 objects. 1 from each girl's dormitory, a personal belonging, identified by a small numbered card. Mine was my spare dress. The dress I'd sewn from curtain linen. The simple one that Corinna had laughed at. Beside it, on the tray, wearing the number from my dormitory cot, was my mother's bracelet. I went very still. The trial master said, "Each of you will reclaim 1 item. Only 1. If your item is not on this tray, you select something that resonates with your instinct. If your item is on this tray, you reclaim it, or you choose to leave it." He looked at the circle. "This is a trial of what you value, not what you are supposed to value." I heard Mireille, 4 positions around the circle from me, make a soft sound. I walked to the tray. I looked at my spare dress. I looked at my mother's bracelet. I picked up the bracelet. My hands were not shaking. My voice, when I gave my number to the attendant, was clear. From somewhere behind the high courtyard wall, from the observer's position I hadn't been able to identify all morning, I smelled it. Banked fire, ancient power, deliberate and present and turned at this exact moment fully toward me. He was watching this. He was watching me choose. And I felt it with a clarity that arrived in my bones before my mind caught up. This was the moment. Not the choosing feast. Not some grand ceremony. This small stone courtyard, my mother's bracelet in my hand, my bare feet on worn granite. This was the moment that mattered. Mireille did not reclaim the bracelet. I had it. She chose the next item on the tray, a silk scarf, with a composure that looked like indifference and smelled, to me, like shame. The trial ended. The girls dispersed. I stood holding my mother's bracelet until the courtyard was empty. Then I clasped it back onto my wrist, where it had always lived, and I breathed. Chapter 8. The night before the feast. The rankings were posted that evening. I didn't go to look. Pell came to find me. She was walking fast with the particular energy of someone carrying news that they are physically struggling to contain. She sat down beside me on the window seat in the main hall and gripped my arm. "You are ranked 2nd, she said. I looked at her. "2nd, Anna. Overall, combined trials. You're 2nd. I let that land. It took a moment. "Who's first?" I asked. "Cassin of Iron Vale." She paused. "But the instinct trial scores haven't been formally entered yet. They're still being reviewed." She looked at me. "Reviewed by whom? Nobody will say." I thought of the gray-bearded trial master watching me set down the rope. "Okay," I said. "Okay?" Pell stared. "Anna, you are 1 position away from—" "Pell." I looked at her. "What does being chosen mean, practically? To you, if I'm chosen tomorrow?" She was quiet for a moment. "It means you become Luna," she said slowly. "First mate to the Alpha King. Which means—" "I know what it means formally," I said. "I'm asking what you think it means. For me. In real terms." Pell was quiet a beat longer. "It means you never have to go back to that house. she said finally. I looked down at my wrist. The bracelet gleamed, moonstone and silver. EV pressed into the clasp. That's not why I'd want it, I said. I need you to know that. I'm not doing this to escape. Then why? I thought about it honestly. The way I'd learned to think about hard things, directly, without looking away. Because I'm tired of being invisible, I said. Because my mother left me something real, and it almost got taken from me. Because I've been told what I am for 12 years by people who decided the answer before they looked. I paused. And because whatever I smelled at that gate 2 nights ago, whatever is in this palace, it doesn't feel like running away. It feels like arriving. Pell looked at me for a long, quiet moment. For the record, she said, I am absolutely here for this. That night I couldn't sleep again. But this time it was different. Not the restless anxiety of a woman who expects to lose, but something more like the feeling before a storm. The whole body knowing something is coming. Knowing it will change things. At some point past midnight I rose and walked to the window. The courtyard below was dark and empty. The moon was at its fullest now. The cold moon, enormous and silver white, hanging just above the eastern tower. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for footsteps to approach from the corridor. Long enough for a door to open and close softly, 2 rooms down. And then, from below, in the courtyard, movement. He was alone. No attendants, no guard. Just a man standing in a moonlit courtyard at 1 a.m, looking up, looking at the moon. Or at the tower. Or, he looked up at the window. At me. I did not move. Neither did he. We stood there, me in a dormitory window with cold stone at my back, him in a silver-washed courtyard with 3 centuries of stone around him. And I felt, with a completeness that removed all remaining argument from my body. I know you. Not from before. Not from history or legend or 2 days of brief glances at formal events. From something older. Something that lived in the base of the chest, below thought. He pressed a hand to his sternum. A small gesture, like he felt it too. Then he turned and walked back into the dark. I stood at the window until the sky began to lighten. Then I got dressed. I clasped my mother's bracelet. I braided my dark hair the way my mother used to braid it, straight back, clean, no ornament needed. I looked at myself in the small mirror above the dormitory wash basin. I looked like Elin Moonvale's daughter. I looked like myself. I walked downstairs to the choosing feast. Chapter 9, The Feast and the Fire. The choosing feast was supposed to begin at midday. By an hour before, the great hall was already humming with the particular electricity of too many people waiting for something that could not be undone. Girls in their finest clothes. Pack representatives at the outer tables. The trial examiners arranged in a formal row at the head of the room, clipboard women and clipboard men, gray-braided authority. And at the center table, still and watchful as a banked fire, Evander Crane. I was the last to be seated. My nameplate had been moved again. This time, I found it placed at the end of the center table, 3 seats down from the Alpha King himself. I almost looked for the trick. Almost checked under the table for a mistake. Then I sat down, straightened my spine, and looked forward. Corinna was at table 4. I could feel her eyes from across the room, that pale, colorless gaze landing on me like a cold hand. She looked at my wrist. She looked at the bracelet. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted, and I recognized it. The recalculation of a person who has just realized the board is not arranged the way she left it. Mireille sat beside her, wearing the silk scarf from the trial tray around her wrist in a manner that suggested improvisation. She did not look at me. Dalla, across from them both, was looking at her own reflection in her spoon. The feast itself was elaborate, 7 courses, each announced by name, served on silver plates by silent staff. I ate without tasting much. I was too aware of everything. The creak of the hall, the heat of the candles, The way sound moved differently near the king's end of the table, something slightly absorbed, slightly charged like the air before lightning. After the 5th course, the trial master rose and began to read the final rankings aloud. Combined scores from all 4 trials, he said, to be confirmed by palace record upon conclusion. He read the names in reverse order. 43 girls. My name moved closer with every entry. 3rd place, a girl from the Thornmark pack, who clapped both hands over her mouth and cried silently. 2nd place. He said my name. I heard the intake of breath around the table. From table 4, I heard something sharp. A hiss, barely audible, from Corinna's direction. Anna Moonvale, Ashveil Palace, 2nd placement, combined trial ranking. He moved to read 1st place. Cassin of Ironvale rose halfway in her seat, composed, prepared, the picture of anticipatory grace. 1st placement in combined ranking, the trial master said, is under adjudication pending review of the instinct trial scoring. The hall went silent. Under review by whom? Cassin's father said from the outer tables. His voice was controlled fury wrapped in formal address. By request of the Alpha King, the trial master said simply. And that was when everything changed. Evander Crane rose from his seat. He didn't speak immediately. He let the silence do the work. Let it spread through the hall until everyone was holding their breath together, until the candles and the food and the politics were all suspended. The instinct trial, he said, was reviewed because the scoring benchmarks presented to me prior to this selection were inconsistent with the results I personally observed. He paused. The trial was designed to measure authentic instinct over practiced response. I observed all trial rooms, as is the Alpha King's right under Ashveil Protocol, Article 9. I heard Corinna's breathing change from 20 feet away. The recalculated rankings, Evander said, place Cassin of Ironvale in 3rd position. Another pause. And Anna Moonvale of Ashveil in 1st. The hall did not erupt. It went more silent. The kind of silence that arrives when something real enters a room that was full of performance. I sat very still. Pell, at her table, was gripping her dinner knife like it was the only solid thing in the world. Evander Crane looked at me. Not a performance, not a royal gesture. Just a man looking at a woman across a table, direct and clear. Additionally, he said, and his voice was quieter now, I am exercising the Alpha King's right of first choosing, for the first time in 31 years. The whispers began. Low, urgent, everywhere, at once. Under this right, he said, I am choosing not from the ranked list. He kept his eyes on me. I am choosing by bond recognition. The whispers cut off. Everyone in the hall knew what bond recognition meant. It was older than the selection, older than rankings and trials and palace protocols. It was the thing the selection had originally been built to find, and had, over generations of politics and arrangement, been designed to ignore. A true mate bond. Recognized by instinct. Unoverrideable. Anna Moonvale, Evander said. Will you come forward? I stood up. I was aware of every detail with perfect clarity. The weight of the bracelet on my wrist. The cold stone under my feet. The candle smoke rising in slow ribbons. Corinna at table 4, gone still as marble. Mireille with her eyes down. Pell with her hands pressed together and tears running free down her face, smiling like she'd always known. I walked to the front of the hall. I stood before Evander Crane. He was taller close up. His eyes were a deep, stormwater gray, and they were looking at me with an expression that had nothing performed in it, just recognition, and a long, deep relief, like a door that has been locked for years finally being opened from the inside. I smelled you at the gate, he said quietly, for me only. 2 nights ago. I thought... He stopped. A small breath. I thought it wasn't possible. After Scylla, I thought that part of me was gone. I smelled you too, I said. At the gate, at dinner, in the courtyard. I left you the note. I know, I said. I trusted it. He looked at my wrist, at the bracelet, at the tiny crescent moons, and the initials pressed into the clasp. Whose is that? He asked. My mother's, I said. I got it back this morning. Something moved across his face, not pity. Something more specific. A recognition of a very particular kind of pain. I had a mother's bracelet, too, he said. I understand what that costs. We stood there in the firelit hall, before 43 girls and their families and every examiner and official in Ashveil Palace. I breathed. He breathed. Yes, I said. I'll come forward. Chapter 10. What Remained. The choosing ceremonies took 3 days. I won't describe all of it. The formal proceedings, and the pack witnesses, and the official records, and the political negotiations that happened in rooms I wasn't invited to, but was told about afterward. Those things happened, and they mattered, but they are not the story. The story happened in the smaller moments. The morning after the feast, Corinna requested an audience with the palace records office and was denied by name. She requested transport home and was provided with a simple carriage, the same tier offered to all non-ranked guests, with no addenda, no exceptions. I was told this by a palace attendant who didn't seem to realize she was telling me something significant. I thanked her and thought nothing heroic about it. It simply was. Mireille came to find me before she left. I was in the east courtyard, my courtyard now, I supposed, in the practical sense of the next few years, sitting on the bench where I'd sat the morning after the instinct trial, watching the light come across the stone. I heard her footsteps before I saw her, and I didn't turn. She sat down on the other end of the bench. We were quiet for a moment. The bracelet, she said finally. Yes, I said. She looked at her wrist, the silk scarf, undecorated. She told me it was a family piece, from the Duskfall line. You knew that wasn't true, I said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. She was quiet for a beat. Then, yes. More silence. My mother makes everything sound like it was already decided, Mireille said. Like the whole world arranged itself in a way that happens to benefit us, and questioning it is ingratitude. She paused. I've been practicing ingratitude. I looked at her for the first time. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was just sitting there, honest in the way that people are when they're exhausted from pretending. Good, I said. She nodded once. Stood up, walked back across the courtyard without any further ceremony. It was not a healing. It was a beginning. Those are different, and I'd learned not to confuse them. Pell was assigned a temporary aide position at the palace, something Evander quietly arranged through a lateral channel that had nothing to do with me officially, except that I'd mentioned her once, in passing, and he had the kind of attention that doesn't let things drop. She cried for about 10 minutes when she found out, then squared her shoulders and announced she would be the most reliable aide the palace had ever seen. I believed her completely. The formal bonding ceremony happened on the 6th day of the cold moon, in the old hall with stone walls and iron chandeliers. There were 40 witnesses, no speeches, and a bonding vow that was 5 sentences long and had been spoken in this hall for 300 years. I wore my ivory linen dress, the one I'd sewn from curtain fabric, the one Corinna had laughed at. Evander's expression when he saw me in it was not complex. It was simply, deeply, glad. We spoke the vow. His voice was steady. Mine was too. Afterward, in the old hall with the candles still burning and the witnesses dispersed, we stood together for the first time without an audience or a protocol between us. Tell me about her, he said. He meant my mother. I thought of dark hair curling in rain, cedar and something sweet, a laugh that involved the whole body. She was fully herself, I said. It made rooms go quiet. She left you the instinct, he said. Yes, I said. And the bracelet. He looked at my wrist. The bracelet is a door, you said, to bring you home. That's what she told me. He was quiet for a moment. Where is home now? It was a genuine question. I could hear that it was about both of us. I thought about the cedar box, empty, the back room off the kitchen, the 12 miles of pines, the gate of this palace at night, and a smell like banked fire, and a knowing that arrived before my mind caught up. "I'm here," I said. "I think I've been heading here for a while." He nodded. Something in him settled, the way stone settles after a long shift. Not dramatic, just finally where it belongs. "So have I," he said. We never needed the dramatic ending. No great confrontation where I stood over Corinna and delivered a speech. Life rarely gives you those, and when it does, they taste less sweet than you expect. What happened was quieter and more permanent. Corinna was removed from Ashveil House, which, under pack law, reverted to Moonvale lineage upon my formal bonding to the Alpha King. The house was not mine in any sense I wanted. I had no desire to return. It passed into pack holdings. She returned to Duskfall with her daughters, and her pale, calculating eyes, and whatever she had decided to learn, or not learn, from all of this. I did not watch her leave. I had other places to be. My mother's grave in the Ashveil Cemetery was maintained by the palace groundskeeping staff from the day of the bonding forward. I arranged this myself through a single quiet conversation with the head groundskeeper, not as a declaration, just as a daughter. I visited twice that first year. The stone was white and clean, her name in the old script. I sat beside it both times and told her things, not all of them, not neatly, but the important ones. I got the bracelet back, I told her, the first time. "I found the door you meant," I told her the second. Evander asked me once, many months later, what I had felt in the dormitory the night before the feast. The night when the moon was full, and we stood at opposite ends of the courtyard, looking at each other across the dark. "Like arriving," I said. "Not frightened?" he asked. "Frightened too," I said. "Both at once. That's the real feeling, I think. Not one or the other." He was quiet for a moment and then, "Scylla used to say that courage was just fear that decided to keep moving." It was the first time he'd said her name to me directly. I held it carefully. "She was right," I said. He looked out the window, the same east courtyard, the same cold stone, the same moon moving through its cycle overhead. "Yes," he said softly. "She usually was." I kept the bracelet. Of course I kept the bracelet. I wore it every day, to formal dinners and council meetings and early mornings in the east courtyard, watching the light come across the stone. I wore it in winter when the clasps were cold, and in summer when the moonstones caught the light and threw it across the ceiling like scattered water. It was not jewelry. It was a door, and every time I touched it, I was home. This story is for every person who was told to be invisible and chose to be seen anyway. For every daughter who carried something of her mother into rooms that tried to diminish her. For every person who smelled something real through all the performance and chose to walk toward it. You were always going to arrive here. The door was always yours.